When you think of church, when you think of the word church or the concept of church, what comes up in your mind? What do you imagine? Do you think of people gathered in an auditorium? I mean, that's easy, right? You're in one right now. Or if you're online, you can see that we're in one. Do you think of online worship? The opportunity to log in wherever you are when you're traveling or you're not feeling that great and you want to still worship? Do you think of a preacher on a stage? Do you think of church music, whether traditional or modern music? Maybe you think of a sanctuary or a choir and organs. What do you think of? Do you think of people standing and clapping and raising hands in worship? Or do you think people are sitting and they're a little bowed forward in prayer? What comes to mind when you think of church? Maybe lining up to receive Holy Communion. Perhaps those are the things that are conjured up in your mind. It sure is for me, and it surely is a real legitimate, really truly church types of images. But what if there's more? What if there's more? What if gathering for worship is the baseline, the necessary baseline? Not replaceable, but it's like the base camp. You have to be there. But what if that's the training and practice time, the huddle, the timeout, so you can regroup, recoup, recenter, refocus, so that, there's always a so that you can go out and be the church. Because the church is not a building. The church is not a building. And I'm so glad at Restoration we can totally say that so easily, right? The church is not a building. The church is a people on a mission with a purpose to share the good news of Jesus Christ with the world. Not just in talk, but in the walk, in the ways that which we walk and shape the world around us and how we live our lives. In this 4-week series, we're exploring the original meaning of the word church that we find in the New Testament. It's a Greek word called ekklesia. It's a word that means called out. It's formed of two words, ek, which means out of or from, and kaleo, which means to call, which literally means then a church, ekklesia, means you all are the called out ones. You're the called out ones. Called out. Not because you're perfect, not because you're better than someone else, not because of moral superiority or religious superiority or spiritual superiority, not you're better or anything like that, but the church is not superior in any shape or form. You may have heard that. Christians acting like they're better than other people. Churches acting like they got an upper hand. We're not. Jesus never acted that way. Jesus came to serve. He says, if you want to be great, you have to be a servant. Right? He came a countercultural message. That's what he brought. So the earliest followers of Jesus, they were nowhere near perfect. They had a lot of issues, a lot of challenges. There was a lot of brokenness. Some of Jesus' earliest followers had serious anger issues. There's this one time, James and John, they say, Lord, send down fire from heaven. Destroy them. Jesus called them the sons of thunder. Right? And yet they were two of Jesus' close, not just one of his followers, they're close, one of the three closest followers of Jesus. The first followers of Jesus were not perfect, and yet they were called out to live with purpose, with compassion and authenticity in this world around them. And that same invitation is for you and me today. Whether you're skeptical, whether you're curious, returning to faith, showing up to church for the very first time, you're welcome here. What we want to strive to do is to be real church for real people in a real world that we're living in. A world that has a lot of great things, but to be very candid, is also quite messed up. A lot of issues in that real space that we can be a church. Many years ago, I was sitting in a small group, and the small group leader, he asked the question, he said to the whole group, he asked the question, how is it with your soul? What a funny question, I thought. How is it with my soul? Like, people say, how are you doing, right? How are you? But the question was, how is it with your soul? And I didn't know how to answer the question at that moment. It's like, what is that? What does that mean? How is it with my soul? Can I look inside and kind of figure this out? What does that mean? I learned it the best way for me to understand that question over the years, many, many years, just keep on asking that question. Then I became someone who asked that question too. It's, how are you doing really? How are you really doing? Right? We're trained to answer the question, I'm good. I'm great. I'm okay. But how are you doing really? How are you doing with God? And how are you doing with others? How are you doing in your private thought life? How are you doing in your view of yourself? Right? I had this crazy realization this week. Isaiah and I were talking, and she showed me this little social media meme. It says, no one has ever truly seen their own face in their entire life. Everything is either a reflection or a photo. And I was like, oh, wow, that's crazy. You know what that means? We interpret everything about ourselves through the eyes and lens of everyone else, right? That's really crazy. And so that real inner questions, the searching that we do, the questioning that we do, the self-work that we're doing, I mean, that's some real deep, hard work that we need to do. And in that space, we really start to answer the question, how are we really doing? It also reveals we don't exist in a vacuum on our own. We exist in relationship to other people. And this thing called faith in God can never be a solo journey. So how is it with your soul? Out of the depths of our spiritual well-being outflow our capacity to do well and be well. Scripture actually says that as our soul prospers, so does our health, our holistic health. So as I sat with this question, how is it with your soul? It actually comes from the very early Methodist class meetings. Gosh, that sounds so formal and boring, right? Like class meeting. I don't want to go to that, right? But what happened in these class meetings was actually remarkable. Class meetings was what John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, called small groups. And in this class meeting was not just a Bible study or a spiritual check-in. They asked this question, how is it with your soul? Because there was a so that. The so that for these class meetings was, how are you making a difference in this world with Christ? How are you making an impact? In fact, one of the mandatory things about each class meeting was to collect funds to make a difference to serve those who are poor, to those who are suffering under poverty. And to pray for those who are sick and figure out ways to visit those who were in the hospitals, that they had a mission beyond just what can I do to grow in my own faith. That was the purpose of the class meeting. A lot of small groups in church today in America is all about how much more Bible can I memorize and learn? How much more Bible books can I read? How much more Christian books can I read? And find ways to kind of, form my thought process around faith and my understanding. But the early Methodist movement was saying that the class meetings, which was really the building blocks of the church, that space was the place where people not only formed in their understanding of God, but what they do with their life. I learned that there will always be a gap, a loss, and a deficit if our practice of Christian faith is only spiritual formation or only social service in how we serve the world. There's always got to be a both and in which they come together. And you'll always find churches that either are in one camp or in another camp. And one of the things about our church here at Restoration is that we want to be about both. We want to make sure that you are spiritually well, that you are exploring the hard questions, digging deep, and really encountering God in some shape or form, and being healed and restored, and really having faith in God, and to represent God in this world, all the goodness of God being somehow impacting this world around us, the well-being of our community. And that's why we keep talking about restoring the wonder of Christ, the beauty of the church, and the wholeness of our communities. You can't take one out and say, I'm just going to do that one thing. It's all important. I love the church. It raised me, shaped me, introduced me to Jesus in a way that has completely changed my life. But I also admit that the church was also a place of hurt. The church was a place of struggle. The church was a place of judgment, hypocrisy, and rejection. And I confess and I say to you all that if that's also your experience, that on behalf of the church, as a clergy person, I'm sorry that the church has failed so many people. We can do better. We must do better. Church at its best is a community, a movement where people's lives are changed through faith in Jesus Christ. Church at its best is where people are welcomed and loved no matter what. You belong here. And church at its best is where people feel so compelled and called and passionate about serving people who are in need so that we might have a more just and compassionate world that reflects the values of God's kingdom. That's when the church is at its best. When the grace of God is truly the primary value and movement in the midst of the people. That's when the church is at its best. It does mean worshiping Christ with all passion. It means to study the Bible real deep. It means to pray and experience God and encounter God. And at the same time, equally, it means to support the community beyond the church worship services. And one of the best places to look at this and to discover this is in the book of Acts. Acts is the account of the New Testament that narrates the early experiences of how the church was formed. And if you do a deep dive into the book of Acts, you'll discover, gosh, this was not polished at all. There were a lot of questions. One of my favorite stories is how Peter breaks the racial barrier beyond the Jewish people to the Gentiles. I mean, people call it the conversion of the Gentiles. No, that's the conversion of Peter. It's the conversion where Peter finally awakens to the idea that the good news of Christ is not limited to one people group, but it's for the whole world. That's amazing. And those questions, those assumptions that break down and new ideas, a new way of understanding gets formed. That's what you see throughout the book of Acts. It wasn't perfectly structured. They were in a new space, new season, new culture. They were figuring out church. It was taking place in the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was very religiously plural, not so different from where we are today. Right? One of the characteristics of the Roman Empire is that they didn't go in and conquer a nation and force them to take on Roman religion. They actually let the people keep their own religion. Right? And so when you go through the Roman Empire, there were all kinds of religions everywhere. And this matters because the text we're about to look at from Acts chapter 2 is on the day of Pentecost when the churches first started. And that's the day when Jews from all over that were scattered throughout the Roman Empire and beyond, they had all come together for a major feast in the city of Jerusalem. They came from all kinds of pluralistic language types of spaces, and they had come. And this was an igniting moment for what the church would be. And we take a look at that to see what we can learn about what it means for us to be the church today. Acts chapter 2, verse 42 to 47, this is what it says. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. Everyone was filled with awe at the many wonders and signs performed by the apostles. All the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. Every day, they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. And the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. Amen. There are 5 major things that are happening here in this early church as soon as it started. 5 things, and those 5 things are reflected in our church. 4 of them is what we do. 1 of them is what God did. Okay? 4 is what the early church did. 1 is what God did. So the 4 things that the church did, that we do, is first is well, I'll say it all first. The 4 is gather, go, give, guide. Okay? Gathering is about worship and prayer, gathering together as people. Learning from the teaching of the church, to show up, to have Holy Communion, to worship and pray together. Go is they were committed to going into the community. When they gathered in the temple courts every single day, it didn't mean that they were going to a religious setting. I mean, it was religious, but you have to understand that in Jerusalem, the temple courts was the community center. This is where the people gathered, not just for worship, but to connect with each other and kind of hang out. That was the place where this was happening. So the early church, they went to the place where the people were every day because they identified as we are a church. We are a people of God, and we're going to go into the community. So go. The third thing is give. They were generous in their giving. They sold what they owned so they could help those in need. And so they could advance the mission of this new thing called the church. The fourth thing they did was guide. That's the word we use for leadership at Restoration. Because we don't think leadership is directive or top-down. We believe leadership is servant leadership. We guide people in their faith. We come alongside them. That's the Jesus way of leading. The apostles led the church, which then eventually led to the raising up of deacons, other leaders, and more leaders, and starting up of new communities all throughout, because they believed in this thing called guiding others in faith. And I love the last part. The one thing that people didn't do, the one thing that we can't manipulate, the one thing that we can't control, grow. It says the Lord added to the people every day. The Lord did it. There's a story later on in the New Testament where the church is fighting over whether Paul, who started the church, or Apollos, who came in after him, was a great preacher. Who's better, Paul or Apollos? Paul or Apollos? And Paul says, hey, listen, I planted, Apollos watered, but it's God who grew the church, right? So the four things that we do is we commit ourselves to gather, to go, to give, and to guide. And you know what? We just leave that to God, and God will take care of growing us in our faith, deepening us, to connect us into the community, to grow what this movement is about in restoring the wonder of Christ, the beauty of the church, and the wholeness of our communities. Now, there's so much more to be said about this passage. There have been many, many books written about Acts chapter 2, verse 42 to 47. There's so much, but I want to focus on one more thing today, and it's about bread breaking. It's about breaking bread. And I learned something about bread this week. Did you know sliced bread was invented in 1928? Sliced bread, right? I saw a meme this week where a young child asks this older person, so, you know that phrase, it's the best thing since sliced bread, right? So, this little child says, so what was the best thing before sliced bread, right? So anyways, when we think about bread today, maybe you're like me. I grew up on Wonder Bread, and which doesn't exist anymore, right? But Wonder Bread is sliced white bread. And, when I thought of bread, that's what I thought of. Sandwich bread. That's what I thought of when I thought of bread. But in the Bible, anytime you read bread, you have to think loaf. A whole loaf. Not even half a loaf. It's a whole loaf every single time. And there's such a disconnect with that understanding that when Jesus does the Last Supper, some of the Bible translators intentionally have to say, the loaf. Because people don't grasp the idea that bread is not slices or pieces that are torn. Bread in the Old Testament and New Testament is a whole loaf. So just imagine that in the ancient text. And folks, people did slice bread before 1928. People took knives and sliced the bread. Really, 1928 was the invention of a machine that cuts all the slices at once, right? So people did slice bread before 1928. But the reason why this matters is that breaking bread, that phrase breaking bread, is actually Jewish in origin. And the reason is, and I never knew this, the reason for it is that when the Sabbath laws were instituted, taking a knife and cutting bread was considered work. And so they had to break the bread. So it's not just, when we think bread breaking, it's a social thing, right? Fellowship, connection, eating together, sharing a meal. But its origins, it was deeply religious and spiritual. It was saying we're going to honor God, we're going to take this one loaf, we're going to break it, and we're going to share in the breaking of this one loaf together. We're connected, we're united, we're one people before one God. That's the significance of breaking bread. So now you know. So next time you break bread, don't forget. You can't unsee or unknow this anymore, right? So now you're in on this. You break bread, you're in a God thing. You're in a God moment every time you break bread now. And so along comes Jesus. Jesus comes out of that tradition, and he takes this bread, and he's with his disciples, and he starts to break this bread. And the disciples, they understand that. They have a Jewish tradition. They understand that. We're breaking this bread. And then Jesus says something really crazy. He says, this is my body. This one loaf that you're used to sharing in as just a sign of our connection to God and each other, I'll tell you what this is really about and how it really happens. This is really a symbol of the real breaking that allows for our connection to God and each other to be so real, for reconciliation to happen. And it's powerful, right? Because at the table, when you eat with somebody, right, there's that saying, you can't be enemies with someone that you break bread with, right? When you're at a table and you're eating a meal together, there's vulnerability there, there's openness there, there's connection happening. And it flows out of what Christ has instituted for us, saying, this is my body. I'm going to give it up for you so that you could be one body. And not just with each other, but with God, you can be together. So every time you break bread, you might not be in a worship service where you have a pastor praying over the elements and praying for the presence of Christ, but even so, you're remembering that in that space it's holy. You're breaking bread. There's God. God is present in the midst of your bread breaking with each other. In that moment, God is there. It's because we break bread that we could bridge the gaps we have in human relationships. Now, why does this matter? Why does any of this matter? Why does it matter today? Did you know today there is this resurgence among Gen Z? There's something that people are calling a Gen Z revival right now. What's happening is that in our culture, and this is not just about Gen Z, but Gen Z is kind of the front and center of it. What's been happening in our culture is that there's been for a few decades a steady and then a sudden decline, after a steady decline, a sudden decline of religious participation throughout the United States. And that, the churches in the U.S., religious groups in the U.S. have also been watching the U.K. to see what's the patterns that are happening in the U.K., because the U.K. is about a decade ahead of us in a lot of the decline that's happening. But what people are observing right now is that there's a sudden resurgence among Gen Z of not just asking spiritual questions, because that questions have always been there, but actually showing up and saying, I need this, I want this, I'm looking, show me. Right? There's this new kind of revival happening, but it's not the kind of revival that you might have think of like televangelists or anything like that. What's happening, what's informing all of this is really that beginning in the UK and now increasingly in the USA, studies reveal that there's a resurgence of church attendance among Gen Z coming in second after the boomers. Right? This is huge. A deeper look reveals the why. Here's the why. The why is search for authenticity, community, and connection. A true grounding in realness. That's why the experience of the table really matters. The connection with each other really matters. And it's not limited to Gen Z. What Gen Z is experiencing as a whole is what is felt reverberating throughout our whole society right now. There is a sense of bankruptcy about authenticity and realness and care and compassion. And people have looked other places. Because one, the church failed. So they started looking everywhere else. And as they looked, they couldn't find the authentic, real thing that truly delivers what they promise. And they're coming back to the church looking for it. And that's a very important why for us. Another reason why is that Harvard Business Review released this report where generative AI, ChatGPT, Perplexity, these things that have really taken a lot of front stage on generative AI. In 2024, the number one use for generative AI was generating ideas. You want to come up with ideas, you want to kind of edit something, you want to revise something, you want to kind of do ideation. People turn to ChatGPT for that. 2025, what they discovered is that generative AI, the number one use is for therapy and companionship. What it reveals is what people are yearning and wanting. The thing about ChatGPT, when you put something into ChatGPT and say, hey, this is an idea, right? ChatGPT is amazing. It'll come back at you and say, that's a fantastic idea. You could throw in the worst idea on the planet and it'll be like, that's a fantastic idea. I'm glad you thought of that. It is the most affirming thing ever. And you're like, wow, I feel good. And so people are turning to generative AI because they're not finding it in the space of human companionship. But human companionship can be messy. And in the midst of that mess, I remember reading somewhere that the reason why human companionship can be so powerful is that when someone loves you in the midst of your worst day, and truly loves you in the midst of the worst, and you've gone through the mess with them, you know they love you. You know they're for you. But the challenge is that there's a lot of fear in getting past that point. So now we have a generation of people turning to AI Because it comes so quick and easy. But the human messiness is where we find the real, authentic, true grace and love that we're really in search for. Last thing, mental health crisis. It's real, it's not going away, and it's increasing more and more. Right? Isolation is real. It's connected to the whole AI thing. Depression is real, anxiety is real. Recovery is necessary, helpful, critical. And though the average person in the church may not be a mental health expert, yet we all can be a strong and gracious community. We can share meals, we can talk, we can listen, and we can build relationships. The hope we have in Jesus Christ is that he invites us to the expansiveness of his table. At his table, we discover a deeper and richer experience of God. I always just get so blown away by what happens at the table of Christ at the Last Supper. You would think that it's a holy moment. It's Passover season, and it's just this holy moment. Jesus is thinking about dying for the world, taking the cross. He's about to suffer, and he's about to get arrested. That's where his brain space is. He's preparing for that. And you would think that the disciples are conscious enough to understand that and that they're in the zone with him. They're totally not in the zone with him. You know what they're doing? They're bickering. They're fighting about who's the greatest. I mean, think about that. Jesus is ready to take the cross for us. And at the table, his disciples are basically what they're doing is, I'm better. No, I'm better. No, I'm better. I'm better than you. No, you're not. I'm better than you. Right? And it's going back and forth. Like a bunch of well, they are teenagers, most of them. Right? And they're doing this back and forth. I'm surprised they didn't get to the point of saying, my dad is stronger than your dad. Right? Like, I mean, it's really like that. That's happening at this Last Supper, and this is the last meal he's going to have, and the last group of people he's going to spend time with before he suffers. And he chose to do that with this group of people. And what's more is that the people at the table, you would never catch them together, ever, if it weren't for Jesus. At the first bread breakers, I talked about that there was Simon the Zealot. The Zealots were trained to even use violence against those who were considered traitors of Israel. And then you've got Matthew the tax collector, who was considered a traitor of Israel. But they're together, the closest followers of Jesus, the 12. They would not otherwise be there. And it doesn't end there. At the table of Jesus, to the right is John, which a lot of scholars believe is the disciple whom Jesus loved, the closest of all the 12 disciples, the apostles. And to his left is Judas, the one who would betray him. And in ancient Near East, in that sitting, and if you're the host, Jesus is the host, if you're the host, the person to your left is the one who is in the seat of honor. Jesus chooses Judas to sit in the seat of honor next to him. That's what's happening at the table. That's what's happening at the table. Just imagine all of that. One more opportunity, one more chance, just one more time, one more moment with Judas, one more invitation. Peter, you know where Peter is, the most famous one? You know where he's on the total other end. He's at the other opposite end of the table. And it's fascinating the way Jesus arranges all of this. Because at the table of Jesus, the most unexpected people are there in the most unexpected seats. And there in that space, we can find ourselves. I hope you can find yourself there. And unlike traditional interpretation, a closer read creates a lot of space for more than those 12. A lot of space for the women who followed Jesus, and more. Who else was there? Matthias had to be there because he ended up becoming the next apostle. That was one of the requirements. You were there from the beginning to the end of Jesus' ministry. So there's a lot of space. If you have more questions about that, ask me later. But you know, like that's so this space is so expansive, a lot more expansive than the traditions teach us. And that gives me hope. The table of Christ gives me hope because it gives space for me to know that I'm welcome and I belong, that I can fit in. As far as God is concerned, we fit in, we belong, and we're welcome and we're accepted. And I hope that's your experience as well. So every time you break bread, see Jesus. Every time you're at a table, see Jesus. And when you're at a table, think about the empty chairs and ask, who's not here that should be here? You know, inclusion is not just about making space for people. It's about believing that they belong there, right? And that's Jesus for us. I want to close with this. The 3 things that you can do is first, come to the table of Christ. In a moment, we'll be led in Holy Communion. But that you make a commitment to say, I will gather, I will be committed to the table of Christ. I'm going to come. And I'll make Sunday worship one of the primary spaces in my life where I get inspired, I receive hope, I get challenged, I get filled and sent out. Second, set the table of Christ. We all eat at some time. Not asking you to create new spaces of the table, but in the tables that you already sit at, transform those tables into connections with the table of Christ. Everywhere you sit, because you have the presence of the living Christ in you, it becomes a table of Christ. Amen? And the last one is a challenge. Expand the table of Christ. Today during Serve Fair, you have an opportunity to sign up for the team where Dinner Church, Taproom Theology, or Bread Breakers. Now, I'm not just inviting you to join a planning team. Anybody can do that, right? Don't just join a committee. Be part of a movement and make a commitment to say, I'm going to be part of bringing at least one person to this thing. I'm going to expand it. Expand a table does not mean join a committee. Expand a table means invite someone and bring them to the table. Expand a table because Christ expands the table for us, and you can do that too. Amen?